Right, well, this second panel discussion is about to start. So apparently we had some difficulties with starting interpreting into English, so I think it's now available on Zoom. So I'm going to speak French. I'm not sure all panelists will do so, but they can speak English, of course. So this second panel for this morning is dedicated to security issues in space, object tracking, debris, and hostile actions. Of course, debris may not be related to hostile actions, but we need to start looking at this, and that's what we do in Europe, particularly. And actually, as Chris McLaughlin said earlier on, the French law requires satellite launchers to take into account space debris that their actions could create. So today's panel is particularly interesting and particularly topical. As you know, and I'm sure our panelists will talk about it, a few days ago there was, I don't know whether we can describe this as an accident, apparently it was intentional, but a satellite was destroyed by a Russian missile, and it caused an explosion of debris in space, which of course doesn't make things easier. And it does illustrate what we are facing today, the issue of securing the many satellites, the growing number of satellites, as we've seen earlier on, that will be launched in the coming years. So that's something we absolutely must take into account. And maybe in this as well, there are new technologies that Europe is well positioned to develop and sell in the coming years. Now, to discuss this morning, we only have 3 people here at this table. I'll have to leave the table. We can't be too close to one another because of COVID. First, we have Xavier Pasco. I'm going to give their names, and then we have Tim Flohrer right next to him. Then Pascal Faucher. No, that's the right order. And we also have François Raffenne, who is in the room, and David Bertolotti. So it's really a comprehensive panel, because they'll be talking first about the geopolitical context today of the fight against debris and space situational awareness, SST. So Xavier will talk about it. Xavier is really one of the luminaries of space policy studies. Well, to tell you the truth, he was in my PhD jury. I think it was back in 1999. So thank you again. Thank you again, Xavier. Well, not only is Xavier someone I really hold in high esteem, but he's also a member of another major think tank in Paris, which is specialized in strategic research. So you have a PhD in politics from the Panthéon-Sorbonne University. You did your thèse, your PhD, on the start of the U.S. space adventure in 1958. I don't think I need to say anything else. Your last work, The New Space Age, From the Cold War to New Space, which was published in 2017 at CNES Edition. So we're going to listen to Xavier for 8-9 minutes tops, and then we'll have 3 representatives of systems or European efforts or programs aimed at fighting space debris. First, Tim Flohrer will be telling us about what ESA, the ESA, does. He'll be telling us about the work of the European Space Agency. Tim will be speaking English. He's the head of the ESA's Space Debris Office.
Space Safety Program Office, Directorate of Operation de l'ESA. Il est à Darmstadt en Allemagne pour faire cela. Après lui,
he's in Darmstadt in Germany. Then we'll be listening to Pascal Faucher, who has kind of a similar position at the CNES, the CNES in Paris. I'm sorry for switching between French and English.
The French expert with 20 years of experience as an international relations advisor and program manager. He works on topics of space security, space situational awareness, and space surveillance and tracking, enfin, qui sont les grands thèmes, les grands mots-clés de ce qui nous a...
So space tracking and SST, which are really some key concepts that we'll be looking at this morning. And more importantly, he's the head of the space surveillance and tracking program of the EU. Also, just one last thing about a UCV. That's something that I thought was quite interesting. Pascal Faucher is also a member of the GEPAN, which is the French group that reviews reported UFOs. Apparently, the new term is unidentified space phenomena, USPs. Well, this will be the topic of another conference. We won't be discussing this morning, but I think still it's quite an interesting topic. After that, so after the CNES, the EU, the ESA, we'll have François Raffenne, who's the manager of... I'm sorry, I have to switch back to English.
Mais enfin, François Raffenne travaille à Arianegroup.
So François Raffenne works for Arianegroup. He's in charge of the GEOTracker program, which also strives to track debris in space. At last, we'll have the point of view of operators with David Bertolotti, who is the head of international and institutional affairs at Eutelsat. Eutelsat is a telecom satellite operator. He will tell us what happens for users, for satellite operators and users, how you fight the threats of space debris on a daily basis. I think I'm going to stop there. Xavier, over to you. Thank you, Laurence. I'm delighted to be with you. Well, I'll be speaking French as well because we have interpretation. I think it's really praiseworthy. And also, I wrote my notes in French. So this is going to be more an introductory presentation rather than a full presentation because our distinguished panelists will get more into the details. So Laurence was kind enough to ask me to introduce this topic of space security today and to give a sort of geopolitical view of the current context. Well, at the time, the Russian ASAT, the anti-satellite, had not made the headlines. Now, of course, the question of the future of space has been brought up quite vividly since this event. It's not the first of its kind, of course, but in the current situation, of course, people are very much interested in the space environment and its long-term preservation. So this event was quite brutal, quite violent, geopolitically speaking. So, speaking of space security, I think we need to take a little trip down memory lane. I think it's very important to do that, to put things back in perspective. It allows us, to really take a step back and to understand deep evolutions in military space and the space situation. To better understand today's issues, the question is that really a new process, or is this all? Are these all these worries that have always been there? Well, the space has always been military since the very start. I think we can say that. This has always been my contention. Of course, you can debate that, but space appeared with the Cold War. Some people say that it's the son of the nuclear age. Well, it was really, the very essence of sovereign power. At the time, there were two superpowers against each other after the Second World War. That two superpowers that had to coexist in the era of nuclear weapons, and space became one way of ensuring this coexistence. But there were also spy satellites. So, but there was really the objective to preserve space. This was a sort of satellites that, of course, countries would not admit to their existence, but they knew that in the national technical means, well, they knew that it was really not in their best interest to destroy the other party's satellites, because, of course, it would imperil this very, very subtle balance of mutually assured destruction. And so they really didn't want to destabilize space. Russians started the first ASAT tests in 1968, 72, then 1982. These were not tests with the missiles, but these were co-orbital satellites that would explode in the vicinity of other satellites. I think there were 72 tests. The Americans looked at this with great anxiety, and they thought to themselves, well, it's all been it's all been declassified. We have a lot of material today, and so they understood that they had to use a sort of marker, and this was a test carried out in 1985 with a missile launched from an aircraft. But they thought, if we get into this, we're going to harm ourselves. For example, especially when you think about debris. When you think at the time of Gerald Ford's term in the 1970s, well, all this already quite had a harmful effect. So there wasn't really an arms race. There were tests, Soviet tests at very specific points of the relationship with America. Of course, there was the SDI, the Star Wars, Reagan's Star Wars, but there wasn't really a real arms race. Space was strategic space. It was meant to stabilize the nuclear relationship. It still does, actually. So it was its first aspect. What's changed with today? Well, for quite a number of years now, we've entered a new area where space is starting to play a new military role. Space is used for military operations. And in this regard, somehow, space is, well, slightly more integrated, more closely integrated in defense systems. So in military thinking, space potentially becomes a target for the opponent. So governments are now understanding that they are going to have to protect themselves in space. So they start to think about programs, maneuvers, doctrines, etc. This is something that's underway. So eventually space is becoming a domain. So this sort of this singularity of space compared with the skies, the land, the sea, all of this is disappearing. And it's very important because it's very important for space control and counter-spatial programs. Now, later on there were signs of this, of course, with, for example, for China, its first ASAT test in 2007, which somehow crystallized all this. So there was the 2007 firing, and we know that today 4 countries did tests recently. The United States in 2008. They struck a satellite which they said was dangerous, so they had to destroy it in orbit. Then there was India in March 2019, and also this ASAT test a few days ago. So
it's important to point out we have this concern to say to others, have the means to destroy your system because it can hit your space systems. And we show messages on anti-missiles by doing this. When you break satellites, you can show the little which has been used by Russia for the site. It's also an anti-missile missile. So there is yet another factor which has grown tensions into space, and because of the military importance into space, it's the getting together of the information world and the space, and using information as a key strategic value. Military collection, gathering data, it becomes C2 in new standards, and space allows to have ubiquity, presence, fly drones. That strengthens the tentative conflictual aspect together with targeting, and also strategic importance into space because it generates activity, it generates tug of war, economic, technological, industrial competition. So space brings about a power factor not only military, but also political, strategic, industrial, and economic. So the price is growing. So we are dealing with an environment which has gained additional value. In the past, it was important. The strategic space value is not the only one. Today, we have modified the space occupation mode. We have more and more objects we will live into space differently. The first panel earlier, I took note of the reluctance of Pierre, and I understand the questions on business model, but things are changing because the technology is ready for that today. And it's important to know where we're going to live into space, and it means we need more reliable, fresh, up-to-date information on the current situation into space. SSA, Space Awareness Situation, SSA, and this link between space and information, acquiring autonomy or independence into space is growing in importance. There is a new strategic value. In fact, today we are aware that information coming from space comes with a strategic value. That's what we call SSA and SST. Eventually, it's all sorts of various activities that will lead to more space knowledge and consolidation of space activities that depend from that, and the strategic value of the need to know more, have more information on the space situation, because as a cascade, we will have an impact, cascade impact on us as space players, whatever the state, because we are autonomous actors into space and leading us to find all our interests, economic, industrial, military, and so on. It's quite interesting. It has to do with the development of the situation and the development of this link which has been created between space and information. That's what I wanted to emphasize. And I'm getting late. I'm running late. One consequence of all this, and it has been mentioned earlier by Denny Waves, has mentioned the word. Not only we will need to know more about the situation, we'll have to play a higher role on how we are going to exist into space. So we need information, and information must be transformed into a capacity to act and discuss. That's called STM, Space Traffic Management, STM. We have to learn now to decide together on collective standards on how to use space and to learn about standards and rules. When you want to play a game, it's better if you can write the rules by yourself. That's what's happening with STM. STM, whether in terms of our proximity, in terms of mega constellation, this will have specific concrete impact on how the industry is going to use all this. So there's a strong political aspect which is made up of economic, industrial competitivity elements. It relies always on a previous knowledge of what might happen. You cannot really have a standard role or claim to have a standard or play or design rules without having the game in front of you, without having a good knowledge. You cannot when you don't understand what's going on. So you need to know in advance. So I'd like to connect the military capacity of SSA to see the technology, and we'll talk later about how we can improve our space knowledge and to have an action lever. It's never easy to connect the difficult or complex technology with the ways to act politically. And that happens very often into space. We often have a lot of technologies into space, and I believe that SSA is not a technological detail at all. That's why today, in geopolitical terms, this field is essential for Europe, namely for Europe, and also because of the relationship between states. Thank you, Xavier, for that very clear introduction that lays the landscape and the background of what we are talking about. That's why we always need to have a politician at hand and the importance of political science in life in general. Let's turn to applications. Let me turn to Tim Flohrer that I introduced earlier, and Tim will tell us what ESA.
It's quite an honor being here. Thank you for the invitation, Laurence, and for the kind introduction. Yes, let me extend a bit on what Xavier introduced in the situation we see in space, and then at the end I will introduce what we are doing in our space safety program, which is the extension of the SSA program. So I'm sitting right in the middle between the geopolitical context, the concrete actions by the EU, and the technology developments in my person here. Yes, we can go to the first slide. And this is something that you all know, but just to recap about the space debris situation, where I'm very much involved in, these objects do not come only from ESA tests. They come from different occasions. They all can be traced back to the launches that we do since 1957. And there have been a number of so-called fragmentation events. We, at ESA, in our report, we count up to more than 600 of such events. Okay, some of them created only a few objects, some created hundreds of objects, and some created thousands of objects. And also there is debris that is released that is not fragmentation related. So this all gives us a quite dense population, and the question is what do we do with that? How does it affect our future use of space? How can we do this in a sustainable way? And actually, how does it affect our day-to-day operations? And I'm unfortunately in a position to talk about day-to-day operations and also about the sustainability for the future. There are ways to get rid of debris. There is a natural decay that helps us. The atmosphere is a great thing, and unfortunately we will see and we know this is not enough. We have to think of active removal, actively remediating the space debris environment. And the next slide then tells us where we record this. We have started a few years ago to issue a report publicly every year, and that gives you an overview on the efforts, particularly on mitigation space debris. And with that, we see this in support of also the UN long-term sustainability actions to provide transparent information, estimate what activities in space are doing to the space environment, and also see how effectively we are following the existing guidelines already. And that you can freely download, as you can see on the next slide. That is now bringing you to the realities on orbit. Let me talk you through. On the right-hand side, you see a reflection what panel 1 this morning introduced to you. It's a revolution going on. And this is the status of last year. So you see this enormous spike at 2020, which is the total count of objects launched into LEO only. So we are forgetting about the geostationary orbit here a bit. Over all the years, we have always seen a total number of around 1,000, 1,200 active objects. This is when I started dealing with the problem. And then there was this steep increase, and now we are adding about 1,500 objects, active objects, every year to LEO. It's a question where this ends, and we heard this in the panel 1, but I can only report here on what we see already. And as you also heard, the vast majority of the objects are from commercial activities, and in particular telecommunications. And that has already enormous consequences in the day-to-day activities. We do collision avoidance to keep our ESA assets safe, and for that we check whether they come close to other objects. And that you see on the left-hand side. This is a breakdown of the other objects involved in such so-called close approaches. And over the years, the majority was different types of fragments. More than 2/3 were different fragments. Now, this has changed rapidly in 2020, and I can confirm this is still the case, and where the majority of the objects are now active objects. They are either part of constellations or part of so-called small satellites, the two mega trends we see today. And that makes the life a bit different, because if you are coming close to a debris object, it's pretty clear what you do. You maneuver. The debris will not maneuver. This is obvious. Now, with this different situation, it's not so clear anymore. You need to coordinate with the other side. You need to make sure that your actions you are taking are consistent with the plans of the other partner. And that is requiring definitely new processes and new approaches. And you have probably read about all these stories that are there that today we don't have that. We need to use the telephone. We need to rely on email. And come on, we are in the 21st century. We're operating satellites. And we have to call another operator to make sure that our interpretation of the geodetic reference datum is the same as the interpretation of the other partner. That's hilarious. I mean, we have technology to solve that, but we don't have deployed it here. Next slide then shows the other aspects of these realities that I want to bring here. We know that in the next 3 years, there would be more satellites launched than in the past 60 years in total. And what we do in our report that you see on the left-hand side, we are monitoring how compliant these are with the existing space debris mitigation guidelines. Those guidelines that are meant to prevent the creation of more debris. And remember, this is on top of the constellations and small satellites revolution that we are seeing. And if you look at this in LEO, you see the compliance rate, this is the little green bar, is in the order of 30%. It's going up over the years, but it's definitely far from what we require. Standards for space debris mitigation and guidelines tell us we should reach around 90% in order to stabilize the environment. Stabilize, not reduce the space debris count. And putting this into perspective, there's quite a concern on that. And on the right-hand side, you see what has happened in the growth of the environment. And a lot of things have mentioned on the ESA test, which are the major events. Also, the collision in 2009 should be mentioned here as a major contributor to debris. I also added here the event on Monday this week, for which we have no precise counts yet. We have heard that around 1,500 objects are tracked by the US. What that means for the environmental consequences, we are estimating that and looking into this. So this raises two major questions that I want to bring here. How can operators effectively and efficiently coordinate actions that they do in space now, because this is an issue already today. I can tell you from managing a team that also does this, and they have busy weekends, more than they used to have. And how much does the space debris mitigation increase the sustainability under evolving space traffic? And that's an open question. I don't have the answer for that. And I have a last slide, I think, which gives an outlook on what we are doing in ESA. So first, we see space as a shared resource, and as I think I could bring here, we are quite concerned about the future of the space debris environment and how it evolves. We heard already about the increase of space traffic, and we would like to say here that calls for globally coordinated and standardized response, fully in support of what Xavier said here, in order to be effective. And two major things that we are thinking about, which is coordinating collision avoidance, but also launching more objects also means increase of the re-entry traffic, and re-entry safety on ground is also something we should not forget. We have seen that a significant part of the risk that missions take today is not from the population that we can track on ground. It's about the untracked population, the small pieces, smaller than the tracking threshold. And that we have to tackle as well. We have to mitigate the creation of space debris. And there we have the policies and standards. They exist and they are understood. But we see in our environment report that I encourage you to have a look that the compliance levels are definitely not where they should be. And now coming to what ESA is doing in the space safety program. We developed the supporting technology for all these. So we look into active removal. We have with ClearSpace 1 an end-to-end demonstration of bringing down an ESA-owned object by 2025. Going there, grab it, first inspect it, then grab it, and then bring it into a re-entry. So really taking out mass from the environment. We look into automating collision avoidance. That's the key thing today in space operations. We look into automating the decision processes, the coordination among operators, but also into having inter-satellite links maybe to allow for late commanding of satellite. These are all components and they all need to be brought together. These are all technologies needed to support space traffic coordination. We also look into different technologies for tracking. We have laser ranging as a key technology that we would like to evolve further. That was not possible a few years ago. That gives us enormous precision, and that is probably very interesting. We look into also space-based optical solutions, so in addition, complementing ground-based surveillance systems. And we look into our models, and especially also in the environmental impact of a mission. So a kind of sustainability rating is something that is very heavily debated and seen as a key tool for regulators to assess the consequence of a mission already before it starts. And this is all, and much more a part of the space safety program that ESA is running as an optional program. And we are on period 1. We are extending from the previous SSA program that we have been doing since 2009. It's not only about space debris, it's also about space weather and also about planetary defense. And the current program has a volume of about 430 million. And we are going to the ESA Ministerial Council next year with a proposal for period 2 of the program. Well, and as a final point, don't forget technology is always faster than regulation. This is obvious. But we really think we can solve the problem only with technology. And we have to coordinate what we're doing on the regulatory side, on the political side, and the technology side. And for the technology, we are here, and we have our tools that you can use worldwide to assess space debris mitigation compliance. We also have analysis that we share, like our report, and we have also our expertise here to help you. Thank you very much, Laurence.
Thank you, Tim, for this very comprehensive overview of what the agency is doing. We can see how much effort is going into this on the part of ESA. Now let us turn to what CNES and the EU might be doing along the same lines.
Thank you, dear Laurence. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be among you today. It's my first public speak face-to-face with an audience. It's a real it's in Paris at Ifri. It's a pleasure to be. I plan to speak English, but I've discovered we have simultaneous translation into both French and English, so I will enjoy speaking French. And I will speak French, therefore, and give you this presentation. There is a PowerPoint presentation I'd like to show you. Thank you. We have it on screen. Thank you very much. And now I will show you, present to you what is made in the EU framework and through the space surveillance and tracking program that have the honor to chair since 2017 now. And quickly on the next slide, show you an ID or a resume of ESA-EST. It's a multi-intergovernmental cooperation gathering member states of the EU, where we deal with space safety and space security, gathering 7 member states. Over the last year, we have monthly meetings, and now we have speeding up the process with weekly meetings with 16 member states involved. Because of the current health situation, we have virtual meeting with over 50 people on distance. We have this partnership, and in this new budgetary pluri-annual framework to turn this SST program, into a key EU space program. we're happy shortly 4 items to tell you that this program is fully operational. I will show you other slides later on the ASAT launch, and we are all ready to follow this event. We supply operational services in the field of collision risk analysis, characterization of orbit fragmentation. ASAT is part of it, and we have a huge research and innovation program. 65% of our budget dedicated to R&D to develop space surveillance capacities, which are necessary to gain a better performance level and to guarantee our self-sufficiency. Without any autonomy of the space situation, we will be blind to risks, and for the military forces, we will be blind on potential threats. So this capacity autonomy is important. It requires investments. Today, the main member states are co-funding the development of these capacities, and this is a virtuous, a very excellent rule. For instance, the figures in the work program for Vision Europe to develop these capacities are aiming at state investments up to 55%, with a co-funding of the EU up to 45%. So states are running risks to invest in developing these capacities. I'm calling today investments today this space security program is limited in size. As you know, we're working on the next budget and up to 350 million euros, combining space and Europe Horizon lines. So these financial means remain limited versus the necessary effort we should make to reach strategic self-sufficiency, acceptable self-sufficiency. I've shared that message. The next item, the third item, which seemed to be important, I want to share with you. We support the competitivity of our European industry, of our startups and our space entrepreneurs. They develop sensors, services in the field of SSA. And today, as it is, we have close to 80% of our budget, which is subcontracted to this industry, and we are going to increase that. We have implemented a new strategy to boost this financial movement to help to support our startups and industries. We have wonderful startups. I know a number of French startups. I will take this opportunity to mention them. Spaceable is or Share My Space and other European startups which do a great job, and we help them. And of course, we have our industries. They have gained a lot of huge expertise in this field. It's true, we have developed and increased this movement in supporting the competitivity of our industry to serve the European autonomy in this field. Eventually, this program fully takes into situation the dual security issue. Space is not only congested but also criticized, and you have you have problems creating thousands of debris affecting our satellites and threats of collision affecting to destroy our satellites. I will turn to my next slides briefly. Thank you. That gives you an outlook on the global sensor program to surveil space used by EU with optical and radar systems, and millions of data are shared daily by all member states to obtain a European space catalog that will probably be made public soon at the disposal of our communities, industrial startups to develop new services available to our researchers. And we use the specificity of what Europe is doing to provide SSA data from various origins, commercial, scientific, and military sensors. That makes the difference from what is done in the US today. That's different from what the Americans are doing. Next slide. You have an outlook on the main services, on the collision risk. It's a high added value service. Today we protect over 240 satellites on collisions risks from high orbit, low orbit, medium orbit, military, commercial, and state satellites. You have a specific list, detailed list of all these 240 satellites which are currently protected from collision risks. And on this, I would like to say that we have access to a network of sensors to refine our work to avoid risks. We have operating teams. They have a lot of expertise in space mechanism. We have also the support from CNES with our Spanish partner. They monitor this European service to monitor the risk of collision. And we have the support of a backlog of 40 years of satellite expertise to supply collision risk expertise. You need to know how it works because we make recommendations to control centers, avoidance maneuvers against collision. It's a major asset to be an operator yourself. As you can see, we have a European fleet. Almost all European fleets are registered on the collision department. So we use Article 8 of the space bylaws that will allow to open these services to third-party countries outside the EU countries. Next slide. So this is just to give you an outlook on the large number. There's a growing exponential number of users organized, over 130 organizations today which have been recorded, which use our services, and especially fragmentation. Report from the ASAT shot. So let's talk about current issues. This ASAT-related fragmentation task force that took place last Monday, 2 a.m. Very quickly, in our process, we have an emergency task force which is set up. So all task members are monitored to follow this event. It's an elite satellite over 2 tons, which has this fragmentation due to an anti-satellite launch confirmed by the Russian authorities, and therefore it's a new doll from Pleset's launch from Pleset, this launch, and very quickly we did activate a few hours after the fragmentation. We did set up a task force to follow up the cloud of fragments. And maybe the next slide. Very quickly, during the early hours, about 50 fragments were identified. There's a quick video you could show us, not this one. Here is the one short video where you can see fragments, and we use optical sensors Okay, let's try to start this video. Okay, here we go. As you can see, the line up of fragments in the view of the optical sensor. A number of fragments have been described by other telescopes. In short, during the early hours, we have been able to identify about 50 or so fragments among the largest ones. So we were able quickly to confirm there was fragmentation, that the Cosmos satellite had been fragmented, and it was probably the largest, the biggest fragment. So it meant that thousands of smaller fragments had been generated. We have the ways and means. We have to stay humble in Europe. Unfortunately, in Europe today, we don't have the necessary capacity to detect small objects, the smaller fragments yet. So we have launched simulation. It's quite interesting. By launching simulation using a fragmentation model, it's possible to use it two ways. Explosion, the satellite can explode because it's been, but you can use it in a collision mode. An external object collides with the satellite and creates a disaster. In the explosion mode, we have identified there would be 240 objects. In the collision mode, we have found 1,500 fragments, which is consistent with the official announcement with the U.S. State Department, because they communicate on 1,500 fragments. Today, we do not communicate on 1,000 fragments, but it's the order of magnitude. We have, based on our simulation, 90% of these debris would take under 12 months, under 1 year. TLE are not yet available on the U.S. space track. We are still blind. We don't have comprehensive full generation. We don't know how many fragments, total fragments. Simulation give us that order of magnitude only. We will continue the simulation on the next slide. It's going to be my last slide to give you an outlook, a quick view. You can see the simulation of what is, what might have happened in the night between Sunday and Monday, early on Monday, following this ASAT launch. Number of debris generated, we have identified fragments, 1,000 kilometers altitude. They were flying at 490 kilometers altitude. The fragments went up over 1,000 kilometers in altitude. That gives you an idea of what might have happened. Debris, after weeks and months, will circulate and move in low orbit. Our 77 satellites in LEO, we keep a close eye on our 57 satellites because they could be potentially impacted by this event. Thank you, Pascal. I will stand up to invite François Raffenne to come here. François Raffenne will sit with you while you're sitting. Thank you very much, Pascal, for this, again, for this very interesting presentation up to date with the last event on Monday, describing the action of the EU. We have heard about ESA and the Union, and in order to raise the issue and to ask how today and in the future how the Union and the agency could pool their efforts and get together to better control the space environment. Not yet, later on. In the meanwhile, we're going to turn towards the private sector because Arianegroup is implementing systems It's what is called the GEOTracking system. Thank you, François.
Laurence.
Thank you, Laurence. So I've got a few slides to illustrate what I'm going to say.
Our international audience. So I will switch to English for our international audience. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to bring the point of view of the private sector on what is undoubtedly a very important and timely issue that was, of course, recently very blatantly illustrated by the Russian ASAT test. Next slide, please. So Xavier did his usual masterful job of setting the scene and describing the main stakes that we currently have to face in the space domain in relationship to those issues of space security. So the space domain is increasingly congested, contested, and competitive, to use the famous 3 Cs that our American colleagues continuously use when describing the current state of affairs in space. And we collectively, as space actors, have to face both environmental threats and intentional threats, both of which can be, of course, directly linked, as was evidenced by the Russian ASAT test. So the example of the intentional threats is on the slide is twofold. Of course, I use the famous example of the Chinese ASAT test. Moving forward, when I will present those slides, I will, of course, use the Russian test as the most up-to-date example of such a willing and intentional demonstration of capabilities. This is exactly what the Russian direct descent ASAT test is. It's a demonstration of the capabilities that Russia has to challenge the importance and the preeminence of space capabilities used by some of its adversaries, namely the United States. This latest test is the culmination of several other tests which did not generate debris, but were still on a very clear roadmap towards demonstration. It is also important to note the timing of such a test. By demonstrating the capabilities, it highlights the reality of a threat. I recall the classic definition of what a threat is. A threat is a set of capabilities linked with intent. Russia, having demonstrated the full scope of its capabilities, it can now fully get involved in what has quickly become a rising awareness among space actors, mainly the need to implement more responsible rules of behavior in space. So expect Russia to fully engage more forcefully in the upcoming weeks in stating that of course Russia is a responsible space actor, and that now is the time to move forward on perhaps more concrete, responsible rules of the road. The environmental threats, of course, is linked to the proliferation of space debris, risks of collisions. Also linked, of course, to the ever-increasing number of space actors and objects in space that has been very thoroughly described in the current trends related to mega constellations. So there is a growing awareness of the rising strategic and economic stakes of space, both of which being thoroughly intertwined in the modern capabilities. So space situational awareness, SSA, and its regulatory corollary, space traffic management, is quickly becoming a very strong strategic imperative. Next slide, please. Arianegroup, as a space transportation company, is very keen on not only the awareness of the threat, but also on the need to actually implement concrete solutions to address it. Arianegroup is known, of course, as the manufacturer of the Ariane launcher. We're also involved, perhaps less forcefully so, in our outward communication in French strategic deterrence. And so we have a very thorough understanding of what exactly is at stake when you talk about the possibility to maintain freedom of access to space, but also freedom of movement and freedom of action in space. Hence the development of a variety of initiatives that we have started a number of years ago, around 10 years ago, mainly around a system that we have called GEOTracker. So GEOTracker is quickly becoming somewhat of a misnomer. It was called GEOTracker initially because we focused on the geostationary orbit, but quickly we've expanded this network of ground-based optical stations to have both surveillance and tracking capabilities in all orbit, so GEO, MEO, and LEO. Why did we focus on optical ground stations? Simply put, because it was the most cost-effective and accessible technological solution that we had for a system that started off as purely self-financed to address our personal needs, and to also develop a system and then develop derived services to not only address our own needs, but to also to enter into a meaningful discussion and service provision with our customers. So GEOTracker is this network of optical ground stations. We've also started to develop satellite laser ranging capabilities for more precise trajectography and characterization of all space objects. And we've also been involved in some military-focused European initiatives, mainly through the EDIDP, so the European Defense and Industrial Development Plan, nailed it, called SARON, most importantly, which we are the leader of and as part of the consortium of European actors. Next slide, please. So GEOTracker is a fully operational surveillance network with a worldwide network. We started off with only a couple of sites in France, and we've managed over rather quickly to develop a current network of 9 sites around the world with 14 dedicated stations. We have a fully operational data center in the vicinity of Paris in Les Mureaux, our industrial site in Les Mureaux outside of Paris. And we're able, with our network, to develop full-blown data management and exploitation center with a dedicated catalog that we maintain ourselves, and also the ability to provide value-added services to our customers, mainly in terms of characterization of and pattern of life and certain other elements. We're proud to say that we have a variety of institutional and commercial customers, including the French Ministry of the Armed Forces, and Arianegroup has been entrusted as a trusted operator to deliver 24/7 operational services to help the French Ministry of the Armed Forces to implement a recognized space pictures and to develop and to enhance its ability to have full intelligence of what is currently happening in space. Xavier and some of the other speakers, of course, stressed the importance for a modern space power to not only have a very thorough, as much as possible, situational awareness in space, both to maintain safety of flight for its own assets, but also to have the ability to monitor the evolution of the space domain in of itself, as France and its European partners move towards dedicating specific operations in space. What has been very interesting in the few years that we've operated the GEOTracker system and its constant expansion is the fact that we have very quickly discovered the reality of so-called submarines in space. So basically, right now, most satellite operators and space users rely on the public catalog that is published by the U.S. CSPA called spacetrack.org. If you're curious, you can access it using an internet connection. And this public catalog, of course, that the U.S. Very broadly showcases to the world, is not fully representative of the reality of the number and of the usage of space, of satellites in space. So 10% of the objects that we've detected using our system are not in the public catalog. And so we maintain our own catalog that we, of course, confront not only with the public catalog, but also with more dedicated and specific catalogs in order to be able to fully enhance our characterization offer, most specifically to our institutional customers. Next slide, please. The GEOTracker system is a dynamic system in order to account for the growing need to have this dynamic space situational awareness. The growing number of actors and assets in space warrants such a dynamic view, and so we're continuously implementing new capabilities. First and foremost, the use of artificial intelligence using partnerships with dedicated and specialized startups, such as, for instance, the French startup Delphox, to provide automated survey tracking and cataloging of objects of interest to our customers, to have improved characterization through machine learning algorithms, to have pattern of life analysis for certain specific satellites, and implementation of command and control functionalities, so that our service is not only something that provides a picture, but also that provides very strong operational support to decision making regarding possibly maneuvers and specific operations in space for dedicated space assets. Satellite laser ranging is also a functionality that we're implementing. The goal is to provide advanced LEO tracking functionalities using an eye-safe laser that is compatible with air traffic safety requirements. This is, of course, very important. The goal is not to put into place something that would create more issues than solutions. And so we have been involved with ongoing experimentations on non-cooperative objects. We have a partnership with CNES on this aspect specifically, and we're very proud to say that we've implemented a European first, which was a successful test campaign using such a laser on a non-cooperative object in October 2019, using a dedicated experimentation station that we have in France. This is something that is very, very interesting to us. The need to have a quick revisit and precise trajectography element will be crucial, specifically for the so-called transition phases. One of the characteristics of a future space environment with several tens of thousands of satellites will be the continuous movement and maneuvers of all these objects through the launch and early orbit phase, the so-called LEOP phase, their operational life, their need to maneuver to avoid possible collision, to move alongside different planes, and also the deorbitation elements. So having the ability to have a full and reactive coverage of this will be key. Last but not least, we're also involved in experiments using daytime tracking. Those of you who know how optical systems work realize how challenging this is. Our test campaigns have provided very good initial results. The goal is, of course, to expand our observation windows, improve our revisit time, enhance the overall quality and responsiveness of our service through extension in the infrared domain. So we have a very thorough technological roadmap. Our goal is to be a fully responsible and provider of relevant space services. And I would like to stress, next slide please, that the challenge that we're currently facing in Europe is one of strategic autonomy, this was said, and the need to fully implement a space traffic management system, not only using a regulatory approach, but also using a capability building elements. You cannot talk about STM without talking about SSA capabilities. Currently, Europe, as is also the case for most other spacefaring nations that are not American, rely overwhelmingly on US-provided data and services. I applaud the work that has been done both by ESA and by the EU-SST. There is still much more to be done. This starts, I believe, by leveraging what is also available in Europe, in the private sector, from legacy space actors such as us, from space startups, of course. But in order to fully be able to deliver a system that fully supports strategic autonomy in space for Europe. And I would end it on that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup François. Et pendant que Pascal Faucher laisse sa place à David, excusez-nous pour ce jeu de chaises musicales. Je vous remercie. C'est vraiment très précieux pour nous de savoir ce qui se passe dans le secteur privé et dans les entreprises qui construisent. Alors, David Bertolotti, on va vous écouter maintenant pour savoir ce qui se passe du côté des opérateurs. Et j'ai oublié de vous dire tout à l'heure, quand je vous présentais, que vous aviez été diplomate pendant 17 ans avant d'arriver chez Eutelsat. Donc une carrière très longue.
J'ai été, oui, je le confesse. Et je n'ai pas non plus de présentation PowerPoint. Je ne sais pas si ça fait de moi un politiste. I'll shift to English for our international audience. First of all, thank you very much for inviting Eutelsat to this table. A telecom operator, a satcom operator. I guess it's no coincidence. It's not just because we're nearby in Issy-les-Moulineaux, but that is also because, as Xavier said, we are, as an operator, transporting data. We are really at the heart of what is being shaped now in the new space environment, and I think really it is the telecom sector that is driving the transformation right now of what's happening in space, both, of course, in the commercial or civil domain, but also, of course, in the military and security domain. So what I'd like to broach today very briefly is two things. First of all, a kind of state of play seen from industry, and I'll try not to repeat what Xavier said, but I think, again, an operator can bring a certain perspective, and then also say a few words about what the industry does about the challenges it is confronted with. So in terms of state of play, it is very clear, as Xavier and others said, that there is a perception of an increased conflictual risk in outer space, and that perception is, even to a good degree, a reality. It is backed by capabilities. I will not dwell too much on the ASAT capabilities because this has been discussed, but as I usually do, I'd like to emphasize the fact that those ASAT capabilities notwithstanding, much of the challenges we are confronted with are not necessarily those kinetic capabilities. First of all, the chief capability that is available to a lot of people, not necessarily spacefaring nations, and that is very cheap, is jamming. It's harmful interference. That remains a very clear and potent threat to space assets, and I wanted to re-emphasize this. The cyber threat is also, of course, just for anybody else these days, a threat. But that gives me the opportunity also to stress the fact that when looking at space, you have to consider space systems and not just the assets in outer space. Space systems have ground segments. And space systems, in the case of commercial actors, are operated by companies that also have corporate IT systems. And all of these can be subject to cyber attacks that could disrupt the functioning of the space assets and the services rendered to the customers. So jamming in cyber should not be forgotten when considering the threats on top of ASATs, and also all the other capabilities that rely basically on proximity maneuvers and that are also potentially dangerous. Against that backdrop, there's very little regulation. There's a lack of an international framework. The existing treaties don't speak very much about space security. As you all know, the sort of space law, international space law creation pretty much stopped at the end of the 70s. The texts that were adopted after that point are mostly what you would call soft law, recommendations, good practices, etc. And it seems that there, maybe I'm not the best place to say this here, but at least from the outside, it seems that there are very few prospects of having additional international instruments adopted in the foreseeable future. And maybe to your surprise, this is not something that the private sector particularly likes. You know, sometimes people have this notion that, you know, the private sector is happy to live in a world without rules. Well, that's not true, at least not from the point of view of Eutelsat. We would like to see a level playing field and more rules binding everyone to those good practices, best practices, good behaviors that some do apply, but unfortunately not everyone. And the third element of this state of play is that because of that, there's potentially a growing exposure of commercial actors to those increasing threats and to that conflictual environment. And why is that? Well, first of all, because of the growth in the LEO environment that was presented in particular in the first panel about mega constellations, especially when you talk about kinetic assets, the LEO orbit is more vulnerable than the GEO orbit, where Eutelsat has been operating for decades. And because also of the variety of assets and the variety of capabilities that are deployed in LEO by an increasing number of private actors, which brings me to the next point on why commercial actors are exposed. It's because also of the increasingly dual nature of activities conducted by commercial operators, which is, I would say, in itself quite a good thing because it means more business, but it means also that you no longer really have, if you ever had, a clear-cut distinction between, you know, government assets that would be, in case of conflict, legitimate targets or potentially legitimate targets from an international law perspective, and purely civilian assets rendering purely civilian services that would not be legitimate targets. And the third important element is, of course, the increasing global coverage by commercial actors, global in terms of spanning the entire arc, but also global in terms of the clients that we serve. And so quite frankly, for a commercial operator like Eutelsat, but we're all, I would say, in the same basket, it is difficult not to be a party to a potential conflict, because we have a very diverse base of customers, And so we are likely to be on one or the other side of the fence at some point. And actually, an interesting illustration of this exposure is the actual drop in share prices that all commercial operators experienced the day after the ESA test. We all lost between 2 and 5% of our share price, which I have to say was probably a bit exaggerated on the part of traders because most of the valued stocks are geo operators, so well above what happened, but still there is this perception that we were exposed. So what are we doing in response to that? Well, first of all, we're trying to organize ourselves as an industry. We have the Space Data Association that's been around for a long time to address the debris problem. So it's not specifically security oriented, but it can help. We are, of course, advocating for rules of good behavior and for preserving the sustainability of space. Just a week ago at the Paris Peace Forum, Eutelsat, among others, Arianegroup as well, and CNES as well, we subscribed to the Net Zero Space initiative a few weeks before other operators, including OneWeb, signed up to a fairly similar declaration issued in the framework of the WEF, of the World Economic Forum. So it shows that there is really an acute awareness in the industrial sector about this. We're also trying to increase our operational coordination to reduce uncertainties by exchanging information. And that, I think, will become even more important as some specialized services, such as active debris removal, become more common. Proximity maneuvers, as I said, are a potential threat. At least they are a potentially suspicious behavior. So it is very important to coordinate such maneuvers in advance in order to be able to discriminate between a potential threat and a legitimate service. But one particular challenge, I have to say, in doing this, in organizing ourselves, is that there tends to be a slight rift between, I would say, historical or legacy operators, such as Eutelsat, and the new players. And having this dialogue with some of the new mega constellations is a bit difficult to remain diplomatic. We are also, of course, investing in SSA and looking very closely at the developing initiatives, both, of course, the institutional ones, but also the private sector-led ones. But again, there I would remind you that all threats are not in space, so that's only one element of the answer, and that is why we're also investing very much in cybersecurity at Eutelsat. And that is why, for instance, we joined the Paris call for security and trust in the cyberspace, and we would like to take a leadership role among space operators so that everyone realizes that this is an integral part of security. And finally, of course, we lobby our respective governments so that they would develop norms of good behavior in outer space. There are a number of initiatives going on. What the British government is doing at the moment in the UN framework is very interesting. We would hope, of course, that the EU would take a full leadership role in that, building on its spacefaring expertise, but also its diplomatic clout, and really lead the way in fighting for international norms. And in doing so, there really is, and that's where I would end, there's really a need to move fast, because the commercial sector itself is moving fast. Maybe it won't be entirely successful in the end, but it is sending right now a lot of things in outer space. and international action and normative action in particular has to follow pace. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, David. On a le temps pour quelques questions. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Alors, voilà. Moi, j'avais commencé à en poser une tout à l'heure, mais je vais être poli et laisser la salle parler en premier.
Thank you. I'm Axel Kraus. I'm a journalist here for Transatlantic Magazine based in Washington. Much of the discussion this morning, if not all of it, has been focused largely on the commercial and technological civilian aspects of space, and it's been most interesting. But I want to come back to the opening statement that Laurence Nardon made very pointedly, that the big story, the big threat perceived as such in Washington and in many European capitals has been the extraordinary missile shot by the Russians into space, causing a huge amount of discussion and debate, and brings me to my question in two parts. I hope Chris McLaughlin is still here, perhaps to participate, but I would like to ask the panel a two-part question. The first part of my question is whether or not you agree with the statement in an extraordinarily good paper that was distributed earlier here about Russia. And this is my first part of my question. Would you agree, do you agree with the statement that they make, that is made in this report, while Russia perceives the space sector as an instrument of power, strategic power, its industry is essentially based on obsolete organization and infrastructure? And I'd be interested in knowing whether you would agree with that assessment, which brings me to the second part of my question, which is, as you look at Russia today and the Putin leadership, do you see the Russian space organization, Roscosmos, a partner, a competitor, or essentially a hostile military threat to the West and to civilization in general?
Merci Axel Kraus. Une question pour Xavier, je pense. Mais comme on n'a pas beaucoup de temps, je voudrais peut-être en prendre une deuxième. Là, voilà. Comme ça, on groupe les réponses et on n'est pas trop en retard sur l'horaire. Merci.
Oui, bonjour. Merci beaucoup au présentateur. Je m'appelle Rasmus Bertelsen. Je suis professeur à l'Université arctique de Norvège et professeur invité à Paris 1. Et je sais que les États-Unis ont des radars très importants pour surveillance de l'espace en Alaska, au nord du Groenland et au nord de Norvège. Et dans les présentations qu'on a écoutées, je ne voyais pas d'infrastructure européenne au nord. Et j'étais surpris de ce fait qu'il semblait qu'il n'y a pas d'infrastructure européenne dans des latitudes élevées. Et ma question, c'est simplement, est-ce que ça, c'est un handicap pour l'Europe et qu'est-ce qui explique cette manque d'infrastructures européennes tout au nord? Merci.
Merci. Alors, je ne sais pas lequel de nos panélistes voudra répondre à cette question, mais peut-être Pascal. Très bien. Mais je vais laisser Xavier répondre sur la première, sur la Russie, la menace russe. Merci.
Okay, I can answer in English or whatever. Okay, coming back to your two questions. For sure, I guess there's indeed a strategic dimension for Russia in terms of using space and in terms of being a powerful actor in space. I'm sure that related to this ASAT test you have in mind, and we all have in mind, related to this test, Russia had in mind also to recall the importance of keeping things balanced in a sense in terms of occupying space and in performing this kind of ESAT, in a context which is very hostile to this kind of move. I mean, we're not in the Cold War anymore. And they perfectly all know. You know, when we see this test, we just can wonder why they did it, actually. At this very moment, you know, okay, they did demonstrate something, and I think it's important, by the way. You have to keep in mind the relationship between the BMD technologies and these ESA technologies. And I think the signals, what it's signaling is multi-dimensional. You know, it's talking about space. It's talking about interceptions and missiles. You know, this is, after all, a missile with an end test in, you know, targeting something and colliding into it. So I think these are, space in a sense has been trapped in a larger than space dialectic between big powers. And Russia doing this, and it's not an excuse, for sure. Russia doing this is just reminding it's a big power, and it's politics. It's great powers politics, in my view. This is one thing, and the second thing regarding Roscosmos, for sure, Russia will remain a partner. I mean, Russia has always been a partner. They just want to make sure that this partnership makes sense for them in terms of projecting their own power into it. And so, of course, we are all appalled by this. And especially right now when we're talking about this zero net space, you know, initiative, and the fact that we're on the verge of maybe deciding of a global ban for this kind of intercept tests. And still this is, and that strikes me, by the way, this is the very moment they choose to perform it. And it must tell us that there's something more than space and asset stuff behind it. Doesn't mean that in space, there's no point for them to be partners. And by the way, they might even use these kind of things to record that they're there and they want to be part of it. But that's my take, personal take. So I hope it answers your part of our questions, maybe.